What's up, guys? John Ross here again with another video for Ross Racing. And we've been so busy at the track these last few weeks, I haven't really had a whole lot of time to do any kind of at the shop technical analysis sort of videos. But with that being said, it's time for me to service the coolant system on the USRA B Mod here. And it's also starting to get hot outside, so I thought this might be a good time of the year to do solving overheating issues type video. So we're going to take a look at what we do to keep this car cool. Obviously this is going to be geared more towards dirt track racing and or just general performance type vehicles. But if you're someone who's new to working on cars, you might learn a few things that would apply to your daily driver as well. So overheating issues could be one of the most frustrating issues that you face when working on engines or cars in general. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is there's a lot of different factors that go into making your cooling system work properly. So there's a lot of different reasons why an engine could overheat. You could easily get into a rabbit hole of just replacing parts and never actually solve the core issue. And then of course the other reason why it's frustrating is it leads to all kinds of other problems. It can warp your heads. It can lead to problems with friction inside the engine, oil breakdown and things like that can eventually blow up your engine. So if it's something you're experiencing on a regular basis, it can be pretty nerve-wracking. I'm going to show you guys, first of all, just like the basic cooling system maintenance that I do on the B Mod here, and then I'll talk about kind of the root cause of some overheating issues that you might experience, either on the racetrack or just with your daily driver. All right, so we got the big green drain pan out. We're getting ready to drain the water out of the B Mod engine. Now we do run straight water in these engines as opposed to the antifreeze you might run in your street car, and that would be the same whether it's a dirt track car, whether it's a drag car, whatever kind of race car you might have. Antifreeze isn't allowed because it's toxic and it's really slippery if it spills on the racetrack. So that's just water. In order to provide a little bit of corrosion protection and also to lubricate the water pump, we run. This is what I use, it's the VP water wetter. There's a number of different brands that make this kind of stuff. So that's a little bit of, I suppose, a pro tip for, if you're racing these kind of cars. That does help protect your coolant system a little bit, and it improves heat transfer. I'm not loyal to one particular brand, that's just the one I happen to have at the moment. But yeah, we do this pretty much just about every race, because the radiator has a tendency to get full of dirt. So you can actually see all the little chunks of dirt that are in there. And that's despite the fact that we're running this shaker screen. It's made out of big chicken wire and little chicken wire laid over each other. That stops, you can see some bigger chunks there. That stops the big chunks from getting into the radiator. But up here in Minnesota, all we've got pretty much is black dirt, and that stuff breaks into small particles really easy and packs your radiator full. So this is one thing that I've learned to do up here is basically after every race, pull the radiator out, wash it out, and that has single-handedly solved a lot of overheating problems. So over here we're getting ready to pop these radiator hoses loose so we can get the radiator out of the car. That's another kind of hot tip, if you will, for avoiding overheating is making sure that these hoses are in good shape. Especially this lower hose over time, if the hose breaks down on the inside and starts to constrict, that'll actually cause what's called cavitation in the water pump, which basically means that it's trying to lift having to try too hard to lift the water out of the bottom of the radiator, and the water is actually boiling essentially from the vacuum the pump is pulling. So definitely try to change these every season if you can. Or, if it's a street-driven car, just keep an eye on them, make sure they're not getting dry rotted and cracked and whatnot. So the next thing to look at while we're over here on the cooling system is the fan shroud. Now surprisingly, a lot of modified guys don't actually even run these, but for pretty much any other kind of car that you would look at, they'd be an absolute necessity. And basically the fan shroud just helps make the airflow through the radiator more efficient by making sure that all the air that's being pulled by the fan is actually coming through the radiator and not around it. There's a few tips and tricks that people give out about how to make an efficient fan shroud. And, you know, depending on where you look, you might see some different suggestions. I've always heard that you want, you know, a 1/4 inch or less clearance from the tip of the fan blade to the edge of the shroud, and you want the fan to be roughly centered where the shroud is, like in the middle of the pitch of the fan blade. Obviously, as you can tell, this shroud is nowhere near perfectly centered on the fan. There's a huge gap over here, tiny little gap over there, and it's basically just cobbled together with tack welds and duct tape. I think the main lesson that I've learned, at least for these kind of cars, is that really just any shroud is significantly better than no shroud. However, with cars that have more restrictive airflow under the hood, for example, that don't have this big gap here to allow, you know, the hot air to escape, it becomes more and more critical that you have an efficient shroud. Well, it's the next day and we got the radiator washed out and put back in the car. Unfortunately, I didn't get that on camera because my phone was running out of batteries, so I wasn't able to capture it. But basically, we just sprayed it out inside and out with the hose. A couple tips when you're doing that. One, always spray the reverse of the direction that the water would flow through the radiator so that you're pushing the dirt out of it and not further into the fins. Also, make sure you're not using too much pressure and make sure you're spraying directly straight into the radiator, straight in line with the fins, so you don't bend the fins off to the side and impede airflow that way or damage your radiator. You can also like soak the radiator in a kiddie pool overnight or something like that to help break up and loosen all the gunk and dirt. That's a good thing to do. But now that we've got that taken care of, let's run through some scenarios that you might be experiencing, some like different types of overheating scenarios, and how I would go about troubleshooting them, and maybe, you know, some tips that might help you. Obviously, the first thing to do if you're experiencing overheating is to check and make sure that the engine is well tuned and is operating the way that it's supposed to. Things like air-fuel ratio, timing can obviously affect how hot the engine runs. Say the timing is too retarded, that can cause overheating. Or say you have a lean condition, not enough fuel, that can cause the fuel charge to burn hotter. And you don't have the cooling from enough fuel evaporating, that can cause overheating. Going the opposite direction, having too rich of a fuel mixture can also cause problems because in an extreme scenario, you may actually have raw fuel burning inside the headers. And you'll recognize that by the headers glowing bright red, which can also be caused by retarded timing, or basically just everything around the headers getting hotter than it should. You know, if it starts burning the paint on your fenders and that kind of thing, that's a dead giveaway that you've got either way too retarded timing or way too much fuel. So, you know, almost everybody knows that running lean can cause overheating, but don't just keep dumping more fuel at it. I've seen that happen. I've seen people make that mistake and just make their problem worse. So now let's run through some specific overheating scenarios, and I've identified kind of three that I think are common. Obviously, the first one is the engine just overheats all the time. Doesn't matter whether you're under caution, under green, in the staging lanes of the drag strip, cruising down the highway, thing just runs hot, turns into a geyser. Now, there's a few things that can cause that. Obviously, one of them is a blown head gasket, and that kind of falls under making sure that the engine is operating properly. Another thing that you can check for in that scenario is to drain the coolant like what I did earlier in this video. And if you see a bunch of dirt, a bunch of rust, a bunch of sludge coming out of your coolant system, that's generally a dead giveaway that things are plugged up and it's not circulating enough water to effectively cool itself. Well, let's look at a couple other things on the engine specifically on the engine that can lead to just a generic all the time kind of overheating problem. So let's start by looking at the pulleys here. A mismatch of pulleys driving your water pump and your fan can lead to the engine overheating all the time. These in particular are 1-to-1 pulleys, which is the right kind of setup for this application, which I consider to be like a medium RPM application. And you can look at the specs of your water pump to see what the maximum operating RPM for it is. So the 1-to-1 ratio means that the water pump spins at the same speed as the crankshaft. Now, in a situation where you have an engine that doesn't turn a lot of RPMs, say for example, a pulling like your tow rig or your street-driven car, sometimes you actually need an overdriven pulley set where the water pump will spin faster. Or in some more extreme scenarios, like say you're running a late model that spins 9,000 RPM, you might actually need an underdriven pulley in that case because you may be exceeding the efficiency range of your pump. Another thing that can cause constant overheating is an issue with the radiator itself. Now this radiator, as you may have noticed earlier, is what's called a double pass radiator, meaning the hot water enters on one side, it goes through the radiator, makes a U-turn, and then the cooled water comes back out on the same side. In the case such as this, you actually have, so here's your tank here, there's actually a baffle that's welded inside the tank that causes the water to make that U-turn. Well, if you run into an issue where, say it's just a poorly designed or poorly built radiator or it's experienced damage, those baffles can come loose to where the water's actually shortcutting over on the other side, going straight from the top and out the bottom without passing through all the cooling fins. You can diagnose that with, I put it away, I don't know where it is, but like if you have an infrared heat gun, you can tell by measuring the temperature of the radiator on both the hot side and the cool side, if, say, this side of the radiator, the cooler side, is significantly cooler, and yet it's still hot down on the outlet, you know that the water is basically shortcutting and not actually getting cooled by the radiator. So another common overheating scenario, especially common in race cars, is something that I call low-speed overheating. In other words, when you're under green, when you're going down the drag strip, whatever, when the engine's at high RPMs, it cools efficiently. But then you get a scenario where, say, you're under caution or you're in the staging lanes or you're stuck in traffic and you start overheating under that scenario. Then once you get going again, it cools off. That's almost always, in my experience, caused by a lack of airflow through the radiator. So that could mean your fan is too small, it's not providing adequate airflow, or you have basically a mismatched radiator for your application. Say you have a radiator that has more rows front to back of fins, and so the air at the speed that you're going isn't penetrating the radiator properly and cooling it. So 9 times out of 10, if you run into that sort of issue, it can be solved by improving airflow. Shroud also makes a big difference in that scenario as well. Now the third common overheating scenario, and one that I dealt with a little bit over the last couple seasons, is what I would call high-speed overheating. In other words, it's the opposite. When you're just cruising around, when you're under caution, when you're not putting load on the engine, it's fine, it doesn't overheat. But under long periods of racing, long periods of high RPM operation, it starts to overheat and it starts to push water. In that case, a lot of times, it's rather than an airflow issue, it's actually a water flow issue. That can be caused by some of the same things that we talked about, like a mismatched pulley set. It can also be caused by, well, here, let me show you. So let me show you here how we overcame our high-speed overheating issue. Now, these are coolant crossover lines. They take hot coolant from the back of the block and circulate it directly to the output here where it flows into the radiator. Now for the small block Chevy and many other engines, water only enters and leaves the block at the front. That means the cylinders at the back don't have direct access to cooling. It has to go through the rest of the engine first. So what you get in that situation is hot spots. You get pockets of vapor essentially where water is actually starting to boil inside the coolant system, and that's causing hot spots. It can lead to all kinds of problems, and it causes your water temperature to go up exponentially. So by giving a direct access for that superheated water at the back of the block to escape, that allows the overall cooling system to function more efficiently. Now another thing that can cause similar issues, and this can really be a contributing factor in all three of the types of overheating that I mentioned, is a bad radiator cap. If you don't have adequate pressure on your cooling system, like your cap is bleeding all the time, even at lower temperatures, that can cause those hot spots to form because there's not enough pressure to keep the water in a liquid state. So hopefully that was helpful for you guys. That's 3 common overheating scenarios that you might encounter in a high-performance engine and some tips on how to solve them. Obviously, there's a myriad of different things that we could talk about. One thing that I forgot to mention, obviously, making sure that your belts are nice and tight. You should be able to turn the motor over by hand by grabbing the fan, or at very least, it should take a good deal of force to turn that. Another thing that I didn't mention or talk anything about was electric water pumps, electric cooling fans. That's outside the scope of what I have any experience with because those aren't allowed in this kind of racing. So obviously those have their merits, have their pros and cons, but we're not going to talk about that here. So hopefully you found that video helpful. Yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about that subject. Gonna get ready here to go racing at Fairmont this weekend. And I'll get some good video there for you guys, hopefully, as we have been. So yeah, if you're enjoying the content, please do all the like, subscribing, YouTube BS. You know how it goes, but that really helps the channel. So yeah, see you in the next one.